of the House of Commons Standing Committee on the Status of Women. We are meeting in a hybrid format with the usual rules. And in order to make sure we have an orderly meeting, I would ask that all comments be directed through the chair. And when you're speaking, please speak slowly and clearly so that our interpreters can hear. Pursuant to Standing Order 106.4, the committee is meeting today to consider a request received by the clerk and submitted by 4 members of the committee to discuss their request to undertake a study of allegations on sexual misconduct. I would begin by asking Ms. Matheson to read the entire text of the motion.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, and I just wanted to say before I read it that I really appreciate that we have come together, that we're taking the time. This issue is of grave and growing concern, I know. So I know that this is a constituency week, but I truly appreciate the work that will be taken by this committee to look at this issue from a very specific gendered lens that Status of Women provides. That the motions, so I move that the motions adopted by the committee on March 11th, 2021 concerning a study of sexual misconduct within the Canadian Armed Forces be rescinded and replaced with the following. That pursuant to Standing Order 108.2, the committee undertake a study of sexual misconduct within the Canadian Armed Forces, including a review of Operation Honor. That the evidence and documentation received by the committee during the first session of the 42nd Parliament in the report titled A Force for Change, Creating a Culture of Equality for Women in the Canadian Armed Forces be taken into consideration by the committee in the current session. That the committee invite the following witnesses before the committee with a 1-hour panel dedicated to the Minister of Defence, a 1-hour panel dedicated to the Acting Chief of Defence Staff and Lieutenant General Francis Allen, Canada's military representative to the NATO Military Committee in Brussels, Belgium, a 1-hour panel dedicated to Canadian Forces Ombudsman and the Commander of the Canadian Forces National Investigation Service, a 1-hour panel dedicated to retired Supreme Court Justice Marie Deschamps, and invite the following witnesses. It's Just 700 Don McElmall-Knott, retired Master Corporal Stephanie Raymond, Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Taylor, that the committee dedicate 4 consecutive meetings to this study, and that the study begins the next scheduled sitting of the committee on Tuesday, March 23rd, 2021. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Very good. I'll hear discussion on the motion. All right. No discussion on the motion. We can vote. Oh, Ms. Vandenbeld.
Sorry, I'm used to doing committee in person, so the Zoom stuff is a little bit new to me. I'm very sorry about that. I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand. First of all, it's really nice to be back at the Status of Women Committee. You know that early in my parliamentary career, I was a member of this committee, and Ms. Gladue, you were the chair at the time, and I think this committee does a lot of very good work. So I do commend the members for taking this on. It is a very, very important and very, very timely study. So as you know, I'm also on the Defense Committee, and we also have done a study, or we're in the middle of a study on this. The one caution that I would have in terms of naming witnesses outright, other than for instance the minister, I think we can certainly name the minister. The one caution that I would have would be that on our Defense Committee there was someone the Liberal members had considered putting forward. We found out that her mother had just died, and if you put that name in public and then she has to explain publicly why she's not coming to committee, I think we got to be very careful when we have certainly the names of individuals. I know that the Liberal members have given me indication that they would like to add names. I understand that the committee may have a process in terms of when the names were to be submitted for this study. I would just venture that if possible, and we did the same thing in the Defense Committee, if we could say that the minister be invited, and then the other names be submitted directly to the chair, knowing that the chair will make every effort possible to invite all the witnesses that all members submit. So I would just propose then that we would have after where it says a panel dedicated to the Minister of Defense, we could just skip down and say 4 consecutive meetings to this study. And I think that's, it's something that's traditionally been done that way, but certainly, Madam Chair, I would imagine that these witnesses would get invited, but just not to have individual names.
And Ms. Sidhu.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to reiterate my support for this important study. That is why we passed the motion last meeting, Madam Chair. I was very surprised by this new motion. I thought we had an agreement to submit a witnesses list for March 19th. Wasn't that the motion that we passed? We have been preparing a list of witnesses who we were hoping to hear from. And then this new motion does not contain anything about inviting additional witnesses. This is a very important study. We all agree on that on the last motion. We want to hear from women and their perspectives. And it will not a good study if we limit our witnesses. All parties should be included. And I have a few procedural questions. First, I would like to make sure that the copy of the motion is distributed in both official languages to the members, especially in French. Second, I would like to ensure that the other motion we already passed requesting that the government respond to the 2019 report, efforts for change remain in place. The feedback we hear from the government should be taken into the account. And would you or the clerk be able to tell us what you thought should be the next step for the study we already passed? If we call witnesses for Monday, will the clerk have enough time to get them headsets to make sure they are properly prepared? But I would ask you or clerk, you can tell us what motion we already passed. What is the next step for that?
Good. Yes, so to clarify, the motion that was already passed has been moved to rescind that motion in this current motion that was read. And so it sort of goes away if this one is voted in. With respect to, do we get it in both official languages? I will ask the clerk to comment on that. Yes, to the getting the incorporation of the report, and whether or not the clerk has enough time. Clerk, do you want to give a few comments there?
The letter, including the motion, was distributed last week. However, I do notice a slight change in a title and an addition of one witness. So I defer to the committee if they would like that circulated now.
Yes, please. And we are tabling, I've just received, we are tabling that report that you mentioned on Monday in the House. So that will happen.
Point of order, Madam Chair. Do we need a unanimous consent for rescind the existing motion?
No, according to the rules of the House, a committee may reopen discussion on an earlier decision if its intent is to revoke it, and if the original resolution is in fact rescinded or discharged, the way is then clear for the committee to make a second decision on the same question. They have given me page numbers in our big thick green book of procedures, 591 and 1064. No, that's the motion, sorry. A motion to rescind is a debatable substantive motion requiring the appropriate notice and only needs a majority vote to be adopted. We'll go next to Ms. Shanahan.
Pardon, Madame la Présidente, je suis désolée, le son, la traduction, c'est le même niveau quand vous parlez que la traduction, c'est extrêmement difficile à suivre dans mes oreilles. Je suis vraiment désolée.
Excellent. Could we have the translators fix that? Because she's hearing both English and French at the same level. Is it better now? Have they addressed the problem? Not really, eh? I'll keep talking while they keep working on that. Give me a thumbs up when it's good. I'll just keep talking. Can the interpreters adjust in any way? Okay, it's better. Very good.
Je vais suivre, Madame. Non, c'est pas mieux. J'entends vraiment les deux au même niveau.
C'est peut-être votre bouton sourdine.
Are you on the mute button? Are you on mute? No, it's on mute, Madam Chair. But I hear the translation at the same level as my speaking voice, so it makes it very difficult to follow. So I can't really, can the technician help me? Because otherwise I can't really follow. Do you have the interpretation button there? Right at the bottom of the screen? Do you see something that says mute original audio, or do you have a choice between English and French? The third button. I had to put it on mute because I couldn't hear anything more.
Can we suspend, please?
Yes,
Mais je pense que là,
let's
c'est
suspend for a
intéressant.
moment while we address the technical difficulty. If the clerk could answer the question whether the witnesses can be called with the amount of time.
Yes, we certainly will try our best.
All right, Ms. Shanahan. Or was there, whose point of order was that you, Ms. Sidhu, again on the point of order, or was it Ms. Shanahan?
Ms. Sidhu.
Madam Chair, I just want to clear is Madam LaRouche didn't get, like, when we start the committee, she understand, like, everyone is saying that it's not good, like if she's not listening from the French, so we can start again what we said that, or because she need to know that what we are saying, what other members are saying.
Madame LaRouche, did you need the group to repeat what they have previously said?
Non, ce sera pas.
No, that won't be necessary.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam Chair, thank you. I'm very pleased to be back here today. I was at the last meeting. It was in camera, but we had a good discussion. We voted on a motion. I have it before me. It's what we have today. It's essentially the same motion, but we have this prescriptive list that's very defined with a few mistakes in it. I'm no expert, but I do believe that there are some mistakes with the ranks that are listed for the armed forces. But we do understand, because when we try to make a list without the help of our clerk and the analysts, and I know there's a lot of back and forth when we come up with motions, to come up with the right witnesses, the right individuals to appear before the committee. So what I see here, I see there's a will here on the part of everyone to undertake an in-depth study with a feminist lens based on the survivals, because that's what's missing in the discussions that are taking place elsewhere. The survivors don't have a voice. They haven't had a voice up until now. And it's not for nothing that the Lieutenant Colonel Taylor came out as she did. We know that this is an issue that's extremely important, and we can see that everything's aligning now, and it's time now to do something. cultural change in an organization is difficult. I know people around this table have had experience with other organizations and that this cannot happen overnight. All this to say, to call these members publicly, particularly for this type of study, I just don't understand how we can be the vehicle to shed light people under the spotlight when it should be their choice. If any study or that we do with respect to sensitive issues like this one, well, everybody knows. We just did a study on Pornhub, which was a study. Well, honestly, I heard things that I've never heard before. I didn't even think this was possible, but it was part of the ethics committee study. But we were very sensitive when we invited people because, well, that's the normal committee practice. We invite people to appear because we know that people want to contribute to the dialogue, but it has to be done when you're dealing with subjects like this. It should be their choice. And we were very comfortable at the ethics committee to give the choice to individuals as to whether or not they wanted to appear publicly or appear with or without a lawyer, or to testify on an in-camera basis. We had an exchange with these people. We even got training beforehand so we'd know how we should formulate our questions, and I think that was very well received. We heard testimony that really contributed, I believe, to a study that will lead to change, because this is why we're here. We're here to observe, to witness the problem, to identify it, and to make recommendations. And I think that it has to be focused on the survivors. That's the contribution that we can make so that we can do something that's really important. So we shouldn't limit the list. And I think that we need to do research here. There are people who are going to want to step forward. And we mustn't limit this list. I do understand Ms. Matheson. She said very well that the purpose of this study was focused or seen from a feminine lens, a perspective. And I think Madame Larouche can help me with the expressions in French, but we have to make sure that we walk the talk. Yes, the walk has to follow the talk. That's right. That's it. And I'd like to hear what Ms. Larouche has to say on this, because I know that this is a subject that is really talked a lot about in Quebec by our constituents, because we don't want to be looking as though we're targeting ordinary Canadians either. We don't want to look like we're targeting them. People are going to be hearing things about things that are very personal. And even Lieutenant Colonel Taylor said in a news report that she was even part of the problem. So there are a lot of things that need to be said. And how should we go about doing this? I think we have to really give some thought to this issue with with the objective of coming up with recommendations that I know are really, people are waiting for them. We need change. And now is the moment we have an opportunity to make change, concrete change. And that's what can lead to cultural change. So that's about all I had to say, Madam Chair. Once again, I'm very pleased to be here with you today. Thank you. Madame Larouche is next on the list. Thank you, Madam Chair. I really gave some thought to this question during the last committee meeting because the debate focused on witnesses, whether she would hear from other witnesses. My colleague, Mario Simard, replaced me. But I looked at what my colleagues on the Defense Committee are looking at, and they're closely following this issue because the purpose is, well, we're not trying to replicate what's being done elsewhere, but I do believe sincerely that we need to bring a feminine angle or perspective to this. That's essential. It's crucial. And our mission at the Standing Committee here is to look at the issue, but we also have to, I don't want, what about LGBTQ plus and people who have been victimized? We can't deny that. We have to make sure that the witnesses feel safe for women, for men, for all communities. But we're at the FEWO committee, so we're bringing a feminine perspective to it. And I'm looking at the witness list. There are some very important mentioned in this list. And there are also witnesses that who appeared before the Defense Committee. At the Defense Committee, I believe there was Sidi, Marcus, Michael, Walter, Janet, German, Benoit, names and ranks that we don't find in this motion here. So I think that I want to make sure that we're not just replicating the job elsewhere or duplicating it, and that look like we're targeting people, because we want to get an overall view of the whole situation. Maybe we need to look at the way the Defense Committee will look at the way the department deals with it operationally. We'll look at it from a feminine perspective and how things are done in the armed forces. So I think we have to have witnesses that are going to be able to give a much broader perspective of the whole issue. However, are these witnesses aren't going to be the only ones? What about an additional meeting where we could get people who could talk about in a broader context? We could perhaps add some meetings rather than just limiting to ourselves to the witnesses on this that are listed in this motion. So I think this is an important mission, and I would invite my other colleagues to give their opinions.
Ms. Alisleb.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to all of our colleagues for taking this topic so incredibly seriously. I think we have all been overwhelmed by the extent that we see that perhaps the efforts to address sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces have not been successful. And this is something that the military has been working on for almost 30 years. And yet, if we look at the things that have been brought forward in the media, we can certainly understand that whatever it is, it has not worked in the way that we need it to work. And parliamentarians have a critical role in ensuring that our institutions, our structures, and the things that we value work the way they're supposed to. And a military is a critical element of our defense and security as they protect and defend our Canadian values. But they must also embody them. And we as parliamentarians need to understand why perhaps they are not to the extent that we expect. So this study essentially has been 30 years in the making. And so what perhaps has been done over the last 30 years has clearly not achieved the standards, goals, and values that we expect of our military and that we expect of our citizens. So this motion today is obviously critically important. So there's two elements. One, we're talking about the who. The who that we want as witnesses that we've outlined in this motion are, for the most part, with the exception only, I think, of two of the witnesses, all current serving members in the Canadian Forces. And as members of the serving Canadian Forces, in the normal course of their duties, they have a responsibility to come and to educate and inform and report to a House of Commons committee and members of Parliament. So I don't think that there's any argument that doesn't support naming them in the motion and having them come forward. The second element of the who is, at no time do I read this motion, I don't believe that it was intended to be an exclusive list of witnesses. And therefore, this sets out some very critical key people that need to come and be witnesses because of the role and responsibility and perspective that they bring. But this is not, as I understand it, an exclusive list. And so certainly on National Defense Committee, we had motions to outline certain witnesses that needed to come forward. But over time, we added to that list. And that very well may be the possibility that we need to pursue in such an important study. But the second element is the how. This clearly outlines this motion that we need one witness on their own for an hour period because of the magnitude of what we need to hear from them and the topic that we need to address with them. So this motion says who are the critical people that we need to start with, and it's well within their job description, roles, and responsibilities to appear for the most part. And secondly, that we need them to come on their own for an hour because of the breadth and depth of what we need to discuss with them. So I think this motion is a critical starting point in terms of where we need this discussion to go. And then afterwards, I think we will more than likely need to have other witnesses so that we can do justice to something that is so serious a topic. I also know that we've discussed briefly that National Defense Committee is also studying this. I would say to the block's point that they are two very different studies. The nature of women not being able to equally serve beside men and a culture that is not embodying that of Canadian values, and individuals who have breached that trust at the highest level and the processes that have allowed that to happen, as well as the processes and structures that need to be in place going forward to change that culture, are two very separate and distinct things. We have a responsibility, as outlined in this motion, to review op honor and the culture of equality for women, and why the processes and structures essentially for 30 years have attempted to do this and not been successful. So therefore, we need to do something differently, but we need to understand what those processes were over that time and why they didn't work and what the missing elements are. That's not what Defense Committee is doing. So this is a problem or a topic that is highly complex, has been going on for many years, and has many aspects. And National Defense Committee is rightly so looking at one of those aspects, and we need to be able to look at the other aspect. And that's why I believe that this motion is so important. And to leverage what Anita clearly said, this is a moment in time where we must say to men and women who choose to serve our country in uniform, but to all Canadians, that this is not who we are. This is not the type of behavior that we accept, and that this is the moment where we must do something differently. And many men and women in uniform have reached out to me and said, we are counting on you, parliamentarians, to be the difference and to show that this time it will be different. So again, thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to speak, and thank you to my colleagues for dealing with this serious motion today in such an honorable way.
Thank you, Ms. Alislav, and thanks to you for your service. Now to Ms. Matheson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't think that I could outline as well as Ms. Alislav just has the need for this study. She did so very eloquently and very, very well, and I agree with those points. The one thing that I did want to mention, in addition, it has already been mentioned. However, if once we get through this list of witnesses and we feel that more there are pieces missing, we've done this in other studies. We've seen this in the studies that we're currently undertaking with unpaid work and rural women, the impacts on rural women from COVID. We looked at what we'd heard, the witnesses that we saw that there were holes, and then we fixed it and filled them, and that's what we'll continue to do. The committee is the master of its own destiny. It can choose to do that, but I think that it's very important that we move ahead, that we pass this motion to move onward, and then we can continue the conversation once we've heard this. I would also like to mention that a lot of the testimony and that gendered aspect, it's why we've put into the motion the consideration of the past study taken on by Status of Women, that was a force for change, creating a culture of equality for women in the Canadian Armed Forces, because we heard a lot of those voices already. That is a key part of this motion, so that we take what we heard in 2019 and we use that to inform this study, this continuation, because yes, it is in the media. And as Ms. Alislav has said, we're not dealing with this properly. That study was so important. Those voices cannot be lost. And so building from that is important. Moving forward today certainly is. But I think once we can get through that, if we see holes, we have absolutely the ability to fill them. But let's move on and get this motion passed. Thank you.
Very good. And I would agree that I've heard from all the parties that they seem to be willing to have additional witnesses, and it is to the will of the committee if they decide to do that. Let's go to Ms. Vandenbelt.
Thank you very much. And, I agree with everything that's been said here about the tremendous importance of this particular committee putting a feminist lens. That is something this committee did in the 2019 study. I think building on that to get real recommendations so we really can change the culture of toxic masculinity and the culture that exists within the Canadian Armed Forces. And also, I think this committee could do much to amplify the voices of women. The women in the Canadian Armed Forces, advocates, veterans, they know what needs to be done. And I would very much encourage this committee to make sure that those voices are heard in this study. I do note, and I did note that Ms. Alislav said that most of the people on this list are currently serving. In fact, that there are a number of names on this list that are not. In fact, it looks like there are some survivors on this list. And I would just reiterate again, we have to be very careful if we put the name of somebody, and we have names we'd like to add, but we're reluctant to do so today because, again, then that person is on the spot and they have to explain publicly if they don't come why they didn't come because it's made public that they were invited. So and there's a couple of other things with some of the names. I did notice that Ms. Matheson corrected some of the titles in the verbal portion, but I would want to make sure that the actual motion that passes has everybody's title precise, just to make sure we don't end up with, a confusion about who is being invited. So I would like to propose an amendment. I would like to put an amendment to the motion, and I can send this to the clerk also, but I'll just explain the rationale for it. I think that bringing the minister 100%. We've seen that this minister has come to committee every time he's been called. He went twice to Defense Committee. In fact, he's going to Canada, China on Thursday. So, he very much looks forward to engaging with his fellow parliamentarians. So certainly, I think having the minister there is a good thing. And then the acting Chief of Defense Staff, I think we need to make sure again that the title is correct and that we're talking about Lieutenant General Wayne Eyre. And then the other person, I do note that General Allen is not yet the vice chief. So her current title is that she is military representative of Canada to NATO. So I think that would need to be noted if the committee wishes to invite her. I think that's legitimate since she will be the incoming vice chief, but the title should be accurate. And then looking at some of the others, the Canadian Forces National Investigative Service, right now they are the ones that are conducting the investigations. And I would really be careful about having the people conducting the investigations coming to this committee. They, in fact, report to the Provost Marshal. And the Provost Marshal could come to talk about what the processes are, what it is that the investigative service does. But I would suggest that instead of saying the Canadian Forces National Investigative Service, that we actually specify that we would have the Canadian Forces Provost Marshal Simon Trudeau come to the committee. So that would be a particular name that we would add. And then certainly the retired Supreme Court Justice Marie Deschamps had a lot of very good things to say before the Defense Committee. I note that she wasn't getting the kind of questions that she should have gotten. So I think that there could be a lot more that she could contribute. So certainly the 2015 report was phenomenally important in terms of the actions we have taken as a government and the actions that need to continue to be taken. So I think that's a legitimate person to have. It's just 700. It doesn't specify a name of a person. I know that was recently there was a turnover in the very, very courageous women who have run that peer support type of organization. So I would just recommend it would say a representative of It's Just 700, so that I know that MC Gagnon, who's done phenomenal work, has just stepped aside, and Christine Wood has taken her place. They should be able to decide between them who would be better placed, or if there's somebody else who can speak on behalf of that organization. And then the rest of them are individuals. So I would suggest that we not include the names of individuals, both because I know that there are other individuals that members would like to invite, but more importantly, we really don't want to put them on the spot. So I think that the chair will make every effort to invite any individual private citizen who gets put forward. I noted earlier that the committee speculated that if somebody doesn't feel comfortable testifying publicly, I know when I was on this committee and we talked about violence against young women and girls, having testimony in camera is always an option for people who may not feel comfortable in public. But by the same token, I think it would be very damaging and a bad precedent to have individual private citizens named publicly in a motion and then have them have to explain later to the media or to others why they did or didn't accept that invitation. So I would propose to take those names out, and then the committee dedicate, you could say minimum 4 consecutive or just 4 consecutive meetings. The rest of it I think is okay. So I do have that in French and English. I could submit that to the clerk since it's a little bit, I imagine you don't have to all scribble to try to get those names. So I will submit that, but I also would strongly encourage the members of this committee to use this forum and this opportunity to give voice to women. We are at a moment of real change. And I want that 10 years from now, people look back on this really difficult time, because we know people are coming forward with stories sometimes from many years ago, and it is extremely triggering. It's extremely hard and courageous for people to come forward. But the fact that they're coming forward now means that we can look back on this as the real catalyst, where we can say this was when things really started to change. And this committee has a tremendous role to play in making sure that that happens. So I will submit that amendment to the clerk right now.
And could you also read it out as well?
All right. Let me see. I've got that pursuant to Standing Order 108, et cetera, that goes right to the part where it says following witnesses. So that part has not changed. So it would be that the committee invite the following witnesses before the committee, with a 1-hour panel dedicated to the Minister of Defense, a 1-hour panel dedicated to the Acting Chief of the Defense Staff, Lieutenant General Wayne Eyre, and Lieutenant General Francis Allen, Military Representative of Canada to NATO, a 1-hour panel dedicated to the Canadian Forces Provost Marshal, Simon Trudeau, a 1-hour panel dedicated to retired Supreme Court Justice Marie Deschamps, and invite a representative from It's Just 700, and that the committee dedicate a minimum of 4 consecutive meetings to this study, and that the study begins the next scheduled sitting of the committee on Tuesday, March 23rd, 2021.
Very good. We'll go to Ms. Dillon.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all our colleagues for speaking about this very important issue. J'aimerais commencer par dire que je suis d'accord.
I would like to start to say that I agree with my colleagues, Mrs. LaRouche and Ms. Shanahan. At the outset, they explained very well that we have to look at things from a feminine perspective, because we are the Standing Committee on the Status of Women. So it's really important, if we go ahead with this study, to do it in a manner where we are able to talk about the survivals, give the choice to the survivors as to whether or not they wish to testify before the committee. These people who have never had an opportunity in the past, we need to give them the choice to talk about sexual harassment or assault, and we will give them the ability to speak. And we see more and more now that women are becoming comfortable with speaking openly. Sometimes it takes 2 years. Sometimes it takes 30 years before they feel comfortable doing so. But that means that they are living with this trauma, and they live this on a daily basis. We have to think of that. And our committee, the purpose of our committee is to empower women so that they can express themselves here, to be open, where women, when they come here, feel that they're protected, feel safe. And as Ms. LaRouche and Ms. Shannon said, if we proceed with the study, we have to do it from a feminist perspective, from a woman's perspective, and our role is not to be investigative. We're not here to investigate. Our role, our purpose is to really ensure that we're giving a voice to women. We talked about toxic masculinity. We can't deny this is a reality, and we see this on an everyday basis. Sometimes it upsets me, it upsets everyone. And another thing that my colleague Anita alluded to was that she talked about whether we should perhaps not include the names of individuals. And Madam Chair, I would like to give these witnesses the ability to decide whether or not they want to testify. It can be intimidating for them, and we have to give them an invitation, give them a choice with open arms. That's our role here at the Standing Committee on the Status of Women. What's most important? Well, yes, it's important to do an investigation, but for once in their lives, give these women the opportunity to speak so that we can find out about what happened to them, so that we can listen to their experiences, so they can feel like their load has been lightened somewhat after speaking. Perhaps we could help them heal. So I think it's important that we work like this as a committee. We read a lot about things in the media. We hear about how these matters should be undertaken. We hear about what the government should do, what the opposition to do. But even as Mrs. Asalev has said, this culture has been around for 30 years. Things are changing, but this problem has been around for the past 30 years. And there have been no great changes undertaken. We want to hear from their ideas, what they would like to see happen, so that we can change things. We've been trying to change things in the Canadian Armed Forces for the past 30 years. Nothing has changed. Maybe it's better to listen to the survivors. And Mrs. Matheson said something very interesting. During the last study, she said that the pandemic effects had to be studied from a woman's perspective. And we have to hear how they experience the pandemic from their mouths. We have to hear their ideas as to how we can improve things to ensure that if the past 30 years haven't worked well, what can we do so that we incorporate change now? And how can we protect these survivors? We have to hear their ideas. And as a committee, I think that today I see that we are all women, and we have to have good men with us too. And we do agree that the Standing Committee on the Status of Women, we do agree that our role as a committee is to ensure that the victims, the survivors, feel protected, safe, welcome to our committee, and that we're able to listen to them and bring these recommendations as quickly as possible to Parliament. So I think we can all work together to obtain this goal. Thank you very much.
Very good. And just to be clear, we are discussing the amendment brought by Ms. Vandenbeld. Next on the list is Madame LaRouche.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I just want to clarify the amendment, which we don't have before us in both official languages. So we're adding Mr. Simon Trudeau to the Liberal amendment, and we're withdrawing Don McMilnott and Stephanie Ramon. Are those the changes that are more or less taking place with the amendment? So we would be keeping the Minister of Defense, of course, and the Chief of Defense, Francis Allen, the Ombudsman, but we're withdrawing, we're eliminating the Canadian Forces National Investigative Service. I'm trying to make sure that I've understood all of this correctly. So Ms. Deschamps, yes, that's the only witnesses, as I mentioned earlier, shows that if we hear from her witness, if we hear from Madame Deschamps as well, this is proof that we can view the same subject as another committee, but view it from a different perspective. So, as Ms. Aslev mentioned, she would bring another perspective to the committee. But we talked about the importance of coming up with some solutions to this toxic masculinity that we find in the armed forces. Last week, there was a reporter in Quebec that had come up with a text back in 2015. Well, an investigation had been underway since then. It's a text that came out in 2015 in Actualité, where they denounced the fact that there has been so many problems in the armed forces, and things haven't changed. And the reporter talked about the courage of Miss Stephanie Raymond. So the names in the motion, and I'd like to hear what the analysts have to say on this subject, because it's not abnormal is it really abnormal to name people in a motion? Could it hurt them? But it seemed to me that we could do this in a motion. I look at what's done in other committees. I see that it's very commonplace to name individuals. So I'd like to know this because Ms. Raymond is a survivor. She could talk to us about the problems in the armed forces. And as far as Madame Deschamps is concerned, we've had her before. We do this. After these witnesses, do we need to add anybody else to the list? Do we have to add any witness to the list for aspects that we have not yet covered? So I want this committee. I think it's important that we have to really understand the question well. We have to look at the psychological harm that's done as well. We have to be sensitive to these types of issues. Perhaps we could add people to this witness list, but I think we have to be open-minded. I agree with the colleagues that we need to deal with this very, very important issue.
Yes, and in response to your questions, yes, we can name people in motions. That is normally done. And the changes that are proposed, correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Van de Belt, is to correct the title for General Allen and the military aid to NATO, to add Simone Trudeau, to add Marie Deschamps, to take away the National Investigative Services. Ms. Van de Belt. Oh, okay, I'll finish the rest. And to modify the language around it's just 700 to say it's a representative of them, not to include the name of the survivors, and to suggest a minimum of 4 consecutive meetings. Did I get it right, Ms. Van de Belt?
Je peux le lire en français, si
Excellent.
on préfère.
Oui.
La motion.
C'est un bon choix.
I can read it in French if you'd like. Just one moment. I sent it. The interpreter would like to point out that I do not have the motion.
And if you can send it to Madame LaRouche, I think that will help also. Thanks so much. Next on the list then, is it okay, Madame LaRouche? Yes. Do you want it read again in French?
That pursuant to standing order up until so the beginning remains the same, and then we continue with a 1-hour panel dedicated to the Minister of Defense, a 1-hour roundtable dedicated to the Acting Chief of Defense, Lieutenant General Wayne and Lieutenant General Francis Allen, a military representative to NATO, a 1-hour panel dedicated to the Provost Marshal, Simon Trudel, and that's because
investigation service reports to. So that is a replacement for that one. Moi, j'ai oublié
I forgot the ombudsman, but I could add him in. So the motion that you have, Madam Clerk, we will add Gregory Lick, the ombudsman, because I forgot about him. And then a 1-hour panel dedicated to retired Supreme Court Justice Marie Deschamps, and invite a representative from It's Just 700. And I eliminated all of the survivals because I truly believe that they should have the choice. And that doesn't mean
don't want to put individuals. It's because they are survivors or advocates of survivors. And I really believe it is very important that we not put them in a position where they would publicly have to say yes or no, because it puts a lot of pressure when we're dealing with this subject matter. That's why I took those names out. So all of them are the same, except the survivors at the end. And I've replaced the National Investigation Service with the Provost Marshal because he is the person they report to and is in a better position and wouldn't have to talk about the actual investigation and perhaps cause a problem with the investigation. So that's the only changes that I've made.
Just on a procedural point, there is not an ability once an amendment has been moved for the originator to amend the amendment. They have to either seek the consent of the committee to withdraw the original one and propose a new one.
Do I have the consent of the committee to do that? Yeah, no? Oh, no, I see a no. Okay, so then my original amendment as it was written is there, but certainly later on, if another member wants to add the ombud back, I would be quite amenable to that.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Yes, indeed.
I would just like to note that when I did read out the motion, I did put Lieutenant Governor Francis Allen's current role correctly in there, so that doesn't need to be changed by any potential amendment.
Good clarification. And the other thing that is missing in the amendment, if I could point out, is the minimum of 4 consecutive meetings. But it is always the will of the committee that we do it. So if we decide to add more meetings after the fact, it's always okay to do that. Next on the list, I have Ms. Alislap.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So I would like to speak to the replacing of the CFNIS with the Provost Marshal. And the argument that was made by my honorable colleagues is that they wouldn't want to have to speak about ongoing investigations. These are professionals. They are experts in their field. They know from years of experience exactly what they can say and what they can't, and what would compromise an investigation and what would not. And I think that it is unfair of this committee to prejudge a senior officer in that regard, that he would be somehow compromised by coming to our committee. We need to understand at a very tactical level the process, the rank structure, and how investigations are conducted, how they are made aware of investigations, all of the process and structure around investigations. certainly not any of the details around any of the specific investigations. And I have a high level of confidence that, being the expert that he is, he would be perfectly in a position to do that. So I think that the requirement to replace him with the provost marshal is not only unnecessary, but would not give us the information to the degree that we need to have that information, particularly in light of the Fifth Estate expose investigative report that came out recently about the challenges in terms of process that some of the investigators in the CFNIS are facing when looking at investigating these kinds of allegations. So that's my proposal or comment on the replacing aspect. With respect to the victims, I think, again, we are doing them a significant injustice by not naming them. Lieutenant Colonel Taylor, Master Corporal Retired Raymond, and Don McElmoy Knott have all been incredibly courageous by communicating in public about the challenges they have faced. I have every level of confidence that were the clerk of the committee to invite them, that if they didn't feel comfortable coming to our committee, they would be more than capable of declining our invitation. And so to not put their names in this document does not in any way compromise them, their safety, their security. It doesn't put them in any kind of difficult position. They have already chosen and shown how incredibly strong and courageous they are to be able to come forward. And so we're simply saying that would they want to come, we want to outline that we would like to have them. And in the case of Lieutenant Colonel Taylor, she still is a current serving member of the Canadian Forces, and she has been very public. And I do believe that putting her name in this motion would allow for us to ensure that we can send a message to her just how important her testimony is and what she has to say, and why at this point her saying it is of such great value. And I am concerned about not having the ombudsman in there, so we do need to make sure that the ombudsman is in there, and we do need to ensure that the committee is dedicating the 4 consecutive meetings to this study. So in terms of the original motion, I can't see any of the arguments that hold water in terms of why we should be changing it. So it is certainly my perspective that the current motion, as given to us by Ms. Matheson of the NDP, is exactly the motion that we need to start this study. And again, I thank for the discussion, but I thank Ms. Matheson for putting this very important and well thought out motion forward. Thank you.
Ms. Sidhu.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On the amendment, I fully support Ms. Vanderbilt's amendment. Ms. Loris raised an excellent point about the testimony from the survivors. Out of respect for the pain the survivors have already endured and how women who come forward publicly about sexual assaults are treated, I want to suggest that some witnesses be given the option of presenting in camera. We have a real opportunity to discover the tools they do and do not work and make a strong, timely recommendation to the government. It is not fair to force them to do this is in public. We want to hear from survivors, but they need to know that their privacy will be protected. We're calling them so that we can learn from their experiences. Finally, Madam Chair, I would like to suggest a sub-amendment for clarification. After the witness list as it stands, I would like to add an each party may submit further witnesses to be invited, and it is fair for everyone. Thank you, Madam Chair.
So the sub-amendment then is that each party will submit further witnesses, and we can discuss the sub-amendment. Ms. Zahid.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to everyone. This is a very important topic, and I think as the standing committee, as members of the standing committee on the status of women, it is really very important that we make sure that this study is focused on the survivors, hearing from the survivors, empowering these survivors, and allowing them a comfortable platform where they can come and share their experiences. And I totally agree with the amendment which has been proposed by my colleague, Ms. Vanderbell, about not naming the survivors in the motion, because that might prevent, like, there might be some survivors who would not like to come, or because like it is not necessary that if a survivor comes out and talks about something at one platform, might come and talk about that in all the platforms. So I think it is really very important that we hear from the survivors, but not include them in the main motion, and all the parties should have the opportunity to submit the list of the witnesses they would like to hear, and those should be in-camera meetings so that they are comfortable sharing and coming out. I think our role is to empower more and more women so that they can come and talk about their experiences, not to be a barrier to someone like coming out.
Very good. And Ms. Sidhu. Was it a leftover or you had a comment? Ms. Sidhu.
Just 2 points, Madam Chair. First, we say that each party may submit further witnesses, and it's not, I said not will, but party may submit further witnesses. That's what I want to make a point. And one more point, also to allow survivors to choose to testify in camera. Like it should be their choice.
Ms. Shanahan.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to go back to the point of inviting the witnesses. And I'd like to stress how important it is to give them a choice as to whether they want to appear, as we saw elsewhere, to say something to a journalist or to... We had this case with Pornhub. That doesn't necessarily mean that the person is prepared to be called upon. It's one thing to be called upon or named directly in a motion. I think that the sub-amendment is to ensure that we can invite other witnesses, because you will see there are going to be a lot of people who are going to want to step up and appear or send a brief to the committee. I'd like to make a point that Ms. LaRouche alluded to with respect to the LGBTQ community. This is a community, particularly in the armed forces, we know they have experienced a tremendous amount of abuse and discrimination. We've heard about what happens, and I think it would be important to include them and those people who... And what concerns me a bit, and when we look at the original motion, it's this... Where we wonder where we're going to be putting our focus of the study. I think we have to put survivors at the very heart of the study, create a safe space so they can come forward and talk about their experiences in this format. And meanwhile, we aren't the vehicle for carrying out investigations in specific cases. Investigations are separate from what we do at committee, and the people that do conduct those investigations are well trained. So I don't see what will result for the committee to see someone who is going to be compelled to say, I can't comment on such and such an inquiry. Whereas if we have an individual like the Provo who can conduct investigation, that's where we can get all the details that Ms. Asalev are looking for. Their experience with protocol and all of that, and how these things are managed. So I think that the friendly sub-amendment would perhaps be accepted by Ms. Vanderbilt. I would support the two amendments to ensure that the motion is much more focused on the survivors. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Just a quick note that, of course, the committee can do as it chooses. If witnesses need to appear in camera, they can ask to do so. I know that our committee and the clerk will certainly let us know. We will respect that. I'm not really sure why this needs to be a sub-amendment, other than the fact that it could be potentially a delay. I would hate to think that the other members are doing that. And I would say that this sub-amendment is unnecessary and that we should move on. Thank you.
Yes, just to clarify, the sub-amendment is that each party may submit further witnesses. The discussion about the privacy of individuals and doing the meeting in camera happened after that, and it's the same as with an amendment. You can't amend a sub-amendment after you've made it unless you have unanimous consent to withdraw.
Right. I think that all these points have been made, right? That the committee is the master of its own.
Well, and it's in our standing orders for the committee that the committee may do in-camera meetings to protect an individual's privacy. Ms. Vandenbelt.
Sorry, I don't think there was any intention for this sub-amendment to become the subject of lots of debate. Pretty sure that we could probably just vote on it. I mean, I know that it was more that we wanted to be sure that the witnesses that many Liberal members have, that I know they're not comfortable putting forward publicly, would still be able to get called as witnesses. So it's really just further clarity. So I don't think there's any harm in the sub-amendment, but I would imagine that we could probably deal with the sub-amendment quickly and get back to my amendment if possible.
One would hope. Madame LaRouche.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this amendment calls for another list. So there's a sub-amendment about having the ability to call further witnesses, but the original motion tabled by Ms. Matheson, that's one thing. So we could begin with the witnesses in the motion, and we, in order to cover those areas where there are shortcomings, I think we could call on other witnesses. I think it's important that we have to be attentive to the purpose of the study. We want to do as complete a study as possible, and to get there, we already have a witness list with witnesses that were suggested. There are some that are key that will enable us to shed light on what's happening. And unlike women are sometimes leaving the force and they're afraid to go back or to come forward. Perhaps I believe it was you, Madam Chair, or one of the analysts that you can confirm. With the original motion that was tabled that we're debating, nothing would prevent anyone, whether Liberals or a member here, like maybe of the Bloc, to suggest after these 4 meetings to add another meeting, another witness to add to that. Have I understood this clearly?
Yes, it is always part of the will of the committee if they choose to add additional witnesses. I believe that Ms. Sidhu has moved this for additional clarity so that it's captured in our motion, although it is always at the will of the committee. Ms. Dillon.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And this is what I said previously. It's really important that the victims, the survivors, have an opportunity to talk. I don't understand what the urgency is to hear from people who are highly in high ranks and not take the time to listen to the victims and the survivors. We're already doing this in another committee. And as I said before, we do know, as members of the Committee on Status of Women, our job is not to investigate. That's something that really disturbs me a lot. I was listening to my colleagues. I'm interested in what they have to say. I have a lot of respect for them. But I would like to say that it's essential that we invite people, even extend an open invitation to survivors and victims who want to testify before our committee. Give them the choice so that they feel comfortable to talk to us about their experiences, what they went through. Even we can see that there's toxic masculinity here. But women are affected by this, but men as well. So it's a whole culture in the Canadian Armed Forces. People in positions of power who can feel that they can harass or assault people. They can commit sexual assault. It's about having control over somebody.
More about control rather than sexual enjoyment or pleasure. I know I'm a little bit getting off topic, but this is what I'm trying to say, that it's very, very important that we look at this question in a way that we empower the survivors, the victims, and we will empower them by giving them the choice to come in and speak if they want to or not. Alors c'est pour cela, je le répète, pourquoi on a besoin des gens dans...
That's why I'm wondering why we want these high-ranking people. They're already being heard in other committees. Our role here in this committee is to really listen to the survivors, the victims. We saw this during our previous studies. We saw this during our study where we looked at the impact of the pandemic on women. Organizations talked about victims and survivors. We had this opportunity. We had the chance to listen to them. They had the opportunity to be listened to talk. So I don't understand why, instead of just getting people in high-ranking positions, that we don't focus more on the victims, on the survivors. I think that we should look at the question from this point of view.
Now we are voting on the sub-amendment that each party may submit further witnesses. Clerk, could you take the vote?
Ms. Dillon.
Yes.
Ms. Shanahan. Ms. Shanahan.
Yes.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
In favor.
Ms. Sidhu.
In favor?
Ms. Zaid.
Yes for the sub-amendment.
Ms. Sahota.
No.
Ms. Shin.
No.
Ms. Wong.
No.
Madame Larouche.
No.
Ms. Matheson.
No.
Results are 5 yeas, 5 nays.
I will also vote nay because it's something that the committee can do at any time. And so we return then to the discussion on the amendment. Ms. Dillon. Yes. We were turning to the discussion on the amendment. Did you have a comment?
Oh, sorry. No, I forgot to bring down my hand.
No problem. It was a leftover. All right, then we can vote on the amendment. If I could have the analyst read the amendment out.
Madam Chair, could I pass this to
Yes.
the clerk to read, please?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. The amendment is as follows. That pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee undertake a study of sexual misconduct within the Canadian Armed Forces, including a review of Operation Honor, that the evidence and documentation received by the committee during the first session of the 42nd Parliament in the report titled A Force for Change, Creating a Culture of Equality for Women in the Canadian Armed Forces be taken into consideration by the committee in the current session, that the committee invite the following witnesses before the committee with a 1-hour panel dedicated to the Minister of Defense, a 1-hour panel dedicated to the Acting Chief of the Defense Staff, Lieutenant General Wayne Eyre, and Lieutenant General Francis Allen, Military Representative Canada to NATO, a 1-hour panel dedicated to the Canadian Armed Forces Provost Marshal Simon Trudeau, a 1-hour panel dedicated to retired Supreme Court Justice Marie Deschamps, and invite a representative from It's Just 700, that the committee dedicate a minimum of 4 consecutive meetings to this study, and that the study begins the next scheduled sitting of the committee on Tuesday, March 23rd. And now voting on the amendment, Ms. Dillon.
Yes.
Ms. Shanahan.
Yes.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
In favor.
Ms. Sidhu.
Yes.
Ms. Zaid.
V.
Ms. Sahota.
No.
Ms. Shin.
No.
Ms. Wong.
No.
Madame Larouche.
No.
Ms. Matheson.
No.
Yeas 5, nays 5.
Then I vote nay as well, and the amendment is defeated. Now we return to the discussion on the original motion. Ms. Vandenbeld.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Given that both the sub-amendment to add more witnesses and also the amendment did not pass, then there are some names that I would like to add to the witness list and add to the motion. So I would be amending the motion to add the following names. Rear Admiral Rebecca Patterson, Brigadier General Lise Bourgon, Brigadier General Andrew Atherton, Dr. Denise Preston, Professor Maya Eichler, Professor Al English, Professor Al Okros, Major General Jenny Carignan, and Julie Lalonde. And like the last time, I have this in a French and English motion that I will immediately send to the clerk. Thank you.
I very much appreciate that you are delivering your motions in both official languages and that we can see them. Discussion on that amendment.
Madam Chair, couldn't you send us or email us a copy of the motion as you did beforehand? Because it would also be helpful for the interpreters. So, is that possible?
Yes, I think this is a very good practice. And so if I can ask the clerk when you receive that email, if you can just send it to the members so they can take a look at what is being proposed and the names on that list. And then we will continue our discussion about it. Ms. Vandenbel, your hand, is it still up or up again? It's okay, it's a leftover. Ms. Aleslev.
Are we debating now
We're debating the new amendment on
just
a list of names that Ms. Vandenbelt would like to add.
So, Madam Chair, the witnesses that that Ms. Vandenbelt has suggested, I think would probably add to our discussion. However, we need to hear from the witnesses that are critical that we've outlined in this motion first. And that way we can determine what additional information we need after that. Because we need to get going. We need to start somewhere. We need to hear from these critical people in the time frame that we've specified. And we've also specified a minimum of 4 meetings. And with that additional list, comprehensive list of witnesses, I'm not sure we could do that in 4 meetings. So essentially, we're trying to now capture our entire study in one motion. And I think that that's just too much for what we need right at this moment. So the motion that Ms. Matheson has put forward is excellent. It's very clear, very specific about the key people we need to hear from for where we need to start on this. And then once we are able to tackle that piece, then the committee can determine what information is missing and who we need to hear from to provide us with that information, and determine how and where the committee needs to take the study next. So while I think Ms. Vandeman has given us a number of very important and appropriate witnesses, let's save them for another time. The motion as is exactly what we need at this time. And then as an incredible committee committed to doing an excellent job on this study, we can revisit what we need to do later after we've got through this phase. Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're welcome. Ms. Vandenbelt.
Yes, Madam Chair, I just want to respond to what Ms. Aleslev just said, because I do think there is a genuine fairness issue here. My understanding is there was a motion passed by this committee previously that didn't name witnesses. Then, of course, we have this emergency meeting that just came with a list of witnesses that Liberal members, of course, have our own witnesses. We're not prepared to put those names publicly, but now that that has been done, what I'm understanding is that my honourable colleague opposite is now suggesting that the witnesses brought by the opposition are the priority, and that the witnesses that the Liberals had planned to submit according to the process that had previously been agreed upon by the committee are somehow less important. And I think that that's a real fairness issue. So I would venture, Madam Chair, that it is equally important that all members of this committee have the opportunity to put witnesses, and not to have members' names that come from one side be prioritized over names from another side just because of the process in which they were put forward. So, Madam Chair, these are vitally important witnesses who have tremendous amount to say to this committee, and I would very much hope that the members of this committee would want to vote to hear from those witnesses. Thank you.
Ms. Saeed.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I agree with my colleague that what Ms. Alice Lev has said is a fairness issue. I think it's an important study, and we want to hear from all the witnesses. Justice should be given to all the witnesses, and usually the process of the committee is that when we submit the list of the witnesses, the clerk then arranges and schedules them to appear before the committee based on their availabilities. So we can't say that okay, those witnesses which are named in the motion are more important than those which Ms. Vanderbilt has submitted. I think equal opportunity should exist for all the witnesses. It is really very important that we treat everyone, and there are no justifications that this one is a better witness or that one is a better witness. I think that is really not the right thing to say. I think it will be unfair with the other witnesses. Everyone should be treated fairly, and it should be up to the clerk to schedule the witnesses based on their availabilities and based on the calendar. If we are saying that we will have 4 meetings and for every panel, the clerk should have the opportunity to schedule the witnesses. Thank you.
Ms. Alice Lev. You're on mute. Yeah,
Madam Chair, I'm very concerned by the comments of my honorable colleague, Ms. Vandenbelt, that she would say that witnesses are opposition or government, and that somehow we determine at the committee who to hear from based on partisan perspectives. I think that doesn't do justice to the witnesses and doesn't do justice to the committee that is wanting to hear independent of partisan appropriate comments on a very balanced and nonpartisan study. This is above partisanship. This is what is in the best interest of the Canadian forces and our country. And so it's very disconcerting to hear it put like that. So let's talk about the witnesses that are in the motion. The Minister of National Defense. One could argue he's a government witness, not an opposition witness, if we were even going to look at framing it in any kind of partisan terms, which I highly would propose not to do. Secondly, we're looking at the acting Chief of the Defense Staff. Well, he's the top military person. Again, not a liberal opposition government witness. The soon-to-be Vice Chief of the Defense Staff, which is the second in command to the Chief of the Defense Staff. The head of the Canadian Forces National Investigative Service, the person that wrote the report up on that created or one of the results from was Op Honor. So these are critical witnesses. These are the logical place to start this kind of discussion, and they are not opposition or government witnesses. They are the right foundation to get the information to provide us, all of us on committee, with a starting point. And we have every opportunity to call witnesses after that. So in the interest of due diligence around a good study, in the interest of figuring out how many meetings we need to do and to do justice to it, we need to get started. This motion gives us a good foundation to get started on this study, and then we have every opportunity to revisit additional witnesses based on the information that we get from these witnesses to do justice to this auspicious responsibility that we have been given to do this study.
Madame LaRouche.
I fully agree that we don't turn this issue into a partisan issue. We want to protect women in the Canadian Armed Forces. We look at the article that came out yesterday about a woman who was able to resign because she was fed up with the culture in the armed forces. This text came out with respect to Ms. Eleanor Taylor. We're aware of this. I think this is urgent. I think we have to get this underway as quickly as possible. And if we don't have the same witnesses as the Defense Committee, that's okay. We do have Ms. Deschamps, but we're looking at it from a different perspective. We have a different lens when we look at this issue. I hope that we're all able to come to an agreement that we proceed with this study, a study that has already been looked at back at this issue before the last election. I think, therefore, it's very important for this reason that we begin. And we're talking about 4 meetings. And we can add to this list if we want. But let's begin with the witnesses that we have. Begin with these 4 meetings. I hope that we're all able to come to an agreement, and we can add witnesses later on if we need to. Ms. Vandelbert, I'm sure that these witnesses are very important. I'd be happy to hear from them, but we have to start somewhere. And we're talking about getting this study underway on March 23rd. So let's begin with these witnesses. And we want to have a committee that's consensual, that puts the interests of women first, and that for these reasons, I hope that in the 20 minutes that we have remaining, that we will come to an agreement and get this study underway as of March 23rd. So I'm asking everyone to work hard so we deal with this essential subject. Thank you.
And so we are voting on the newest amendment to add the witnesses that Ms. Vandenbelt specified. Clerk, you may take the vote.
Ms. Dillon.
Yes.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
In favor.
Ms. Shanahan.
Yes.
Ms. Sidhu.
Yes.
Ms. Zaid.
Yes.
Ms. Sahota.
No.
Ms. Shin.
No.
Ms. Wong.
No.
Madame Larouche.
No.
Ms. Matheson.
No.
5 yeas, 5 nays.
I also vote no. And so we return to the discussion on the original motion. Seeing no further comments, so we'll call the question on the original motion. Clerk, you may take the vote.
Ms. Dillon.
Yes.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
In favor.
Ms. Shanahan.
Yes.
Ms. Sidhu.
In favor?
Ms. Zaid.
Yes.
Ms. Sahota.
Can you read out the motion again, please?
It's been sent to your P9.
Ms. Shin.
Yes.
Ms. Wong.
Yes.
Madame Larouche.
Oui.
Ms. Matheson.
Yes.
Ms. Sahota.
Yes.
10 yeas.
Excellent. And so the clerk will then organize the meetings as per the motion. I wanted to let you all know that we are tabling our COVID-19 report in the House and intending to do a press release to let people know that it's available. And I believe the clerk is going to send the wording on that so that you can have a look. So I will see you all then at our next meeting on the 23rd. This meeting is adjourned. Oh, wait. Do I have a motion to adjourn? Is it the will of the committee to adjourn? Very good. Is that a comment, Ms. Shanahan?
I just wanted to ask about when we can submit witnesses to this study, if the clerk can give us some instructions on that.
You can begin sending them as you wish. Initially we had discussed a deadline, but we will proceed with the motion as adopted today and the timeline that's indicated in that motion.
Very good. Madame LaRouche.
I was going to ask basically the same question as Ms. Shanahan. We also had a common witness, so I think it'd be interesting. I would invite the other committee members to suggest names because I hope that we're going to be able to add 1 or 2 extra meetings. But I do understand. I think the deadline is the 18th. Do we have any additional time that's going to be added to that?
It's to the will of the committee to add witnesses and add meetings as they want. We have in this motion the priority of how we will proceed, and then from there, at the next opportunity for committee business, or the next time we're talking about this topic, then the committee can add witnesses. Is it the will of the committee to adjourn? Very good. Meeting adjourned.